4 years ago, in late October, I just started a new job at a small gas station on the edge of town. It wasn't exactly my dream position, but it was decent enough to cover my bills. That Halloween, my friends were hosting a huge party. Everyone I knew was going, and it was shaping up to be the kind of event people talk about for years afterward. Unfortunately, because I was still so new on the job, I hadn't earned any time off. My friends understood, but I couldn't help feeling a little left out as I donned my uniform that evening. The shift started at 8, and the streets outside were already buzzing with kids in costumes. Groups of them darted between houses, their laughter carrying over the faint hum of passing cars. Still, there wasn't much traffic at the pumps. By the time the clock hit 9, it was quiet, too quiet. Only a handful of cars stopped by in that first hour, and even fewer showed up as the night wore on. Every 15 minutes or so, a police cruiser would pass by, its slow patrol a reminder that even on Halloween, the small-town police were keeping watch. Other than that, the roads were dead. I'll admit, I was a bit restless. Scrolling through my phone, I saw photos and videos from the party I was missing. People were laughing, dancing, showing off their costumes. I felt a pang of envy but told myself that at least I'd have a story to tell from my Halloween shift. That's when I decided to grab a few boxes from the back room and restock some shelves. It wasn't much, but at least it gave me something to do. As I was stacking snacks near the candy aisle, I heard the familiar ding of the front door. I glanced up to see 3 men walk in. At first, I thought they were just more late-night trick-or-treaters. After all, they were wearing full Halloween costumes, complete with masks. But these weren't kids. These were grown men. One was dressed as Michael Myers, the iconic slasher character, and the other two wore costumes I didn't recognize. The one had a thick beard poking out from under his mask and tattoos climbing up his neck. I greeted them casually, more out of habit than anything else, but they didn't respond. They just moved silently down the candy aisle. I wasn't sure why, but the way they carried themselves put me on edge. Something about the way they kept their masks on, even after coming inside, felt off. Trying to shake the feeling, I returned to the counter, waiting for them to grab whatever candy they wanted. When they finally came over, they dropped a single bag of Dum-Dums on the counter. It struck me as odd. 3 grown men, each fully costumed, going out of their way for a bag of lollipops. But I rang them up without comment and gave them their total. One of the men stepped forward to pay in cash, his movements oddly stiff and deliberate. I could feel another pair of eyes on me. When I looked up, one of them was standing a few feet back, his masked face turned toward me. Though I couldn't see his expression, his eyes were locked on me, cold and unblinking. I handed over the change and forced a quick, "Have a good night." But instead of leaving, one of them walked to the door and did something I didn't expect. He reached out and pulled the bolt lock down. I froze. Before I could even react, the man who'd been staring at me suddenly moved around the counter. In an instant, he shoved me to the ground. It happened so fast, I didn't have time to process it. I tried to stay calm, telling them they could take the money from the register, that I wouldn't resist. But one of the others stepped forward, ignoring the cash drawer entirely. He pulled out zip ties and bound my hands. My mind raced. They weren't after the money. What else could they possibly want? Without a word, they yanked me to my feet and started dragging me toward the door. As we moved, I glanced outside and noticed an old car parked on the grass near the edge of the lot. It was dark, partially hidden behind some trees, and it didn't look like it had been there long. My stomach sank as I realized that had to be their getaway car. Just as we reached the edge of the lot, a brilliant flash of red and blue lights swept over us. A police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, its headlights flooding the scene. The men dropped me immediately and bolted toward their car. I was still struggling to process what was happening, but the officers didn't hesitate. Within moments, the police had them in custody. Backup arrived in less than a minute, and I was left sitting on the curb, my hands finally free, shaking from adrenaline. The police explained that earlier in the night, they'd received reports of 3 costumed men attempting to lure children away from their homes with promises of candy. That's why the cruiser had been circling the area all evening. I felt a wave of relief, knowing that the officers had shown up just in time. The thought of what could have happened if they hadn't made it there sent a shiver down my spine. What the men intended remains a mystery. None of them confessed to anything, and no definitive link to a larger plan was ever proven. But the incident haunted me long after that night. It made me question how I could have handled the situation differently and whether there were warning signs I'd missed. With Halloween coming up again, I still think back to that night, wondering how close I came to a much darker ending. It's a reminder that sometimes, even the simplest job on a quiet night can take a turn you never saw coming. Last fall, I took a long road trip up to Alaska to visit my grandparents, who live in a cozy little cabin nestled in the remote wilderness. I don't see them often, so I decided to spend some time there before the weather turned harsh. Several other family members flew in for the occasion, making it a mini reunion of sorts. But as October rolled on, the temperatures dropped sharply and snow was forecasted. I knew I'd have to head back home soon, before the roads became treacherous. The journey back wasn't easy. The highway that runs from Alaska through Canada is notoriously remote. For hours on end, it winds through vast forests, rugged mountains, and empty valleys. Cell service is non-existent, and there are only a handful of truck stops and public camping spots scattered along the way. By the second day of driving, I was pretty worn out. As night fell, I pulled off onto a narrow dirt road that led to a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a flat patch between the trees, but it was enough for me to park my RV and get some rest. I'd done this sort of thing plenty of times. Sleeping in the middle of nowhere wasn't new to me, and I usually found the solitude peaceful rather than unnerving. That night, I made myself a quick dinner, settled into bed, and started watching a movie. For a while, it was quiet. The only sounds were the occasional gust of wind rustling the trees and the faint hum of my RV's heater. But then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I sat up, my senses suddenly on high alert. Pulling back the blinds on one of the windows, I peered out into the pitch-black woods. The darkness was absolute. Without exterior lights, I couldn't see a thing. Still, the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it might just be an animal. After all, I was out in the middle of the wilderness. Yet something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too steady, too measured, like someone pacing nearby. I considered turning on the RV's exterior lights to see what was out there. But if someone, or something, was really lurking around, maybe it was better not to make my presence known. I stayed still and quiet, hoping whoever, or whatever, was out there would lose interest. After a while, the footsteps stopped, and I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I went back to my movie and eventually turned in for the night, setting my alarm to start driving early the next morning. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke suddenly to a loud knocking at the door. 3 hard, deliberate bangs. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up and switched on the small reading light beside me. The knocks came again, more insistent this time. "I just need some water, please, and then I'll be on my way," a deep voice called from the other side of the door. It sounded like an older man, but something about it felt off. I glanced at the clock. 2 in the morning, in the freezing cold? This made no sense. "Why are you out here?" I called back, my voice shaky. "How did you even get here?" A brief silence followed before the voice replied. "My truck broke down just a couple miles back. I'm just looking for some help, that's all. I don't mean any trouble." Every instinct in me screamed that this wasn't right. If his truck had really broken down, why hadn't I seen it on the way in? And if he'd been walking for miles in the freezing cold, he wouldn't be asking for just water. He'd need real help, and at the very least, he'd be banging louder or shouting for assistance. I crept over to a side window, careful not to make any noise, and peeked through the blinds. It was hard to make out much, but I could see his silhouette. He was standing right up against the door, almost pressing into it. Why was he so close? It was as if he were listening for movement inside. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A shadowy figure moved behind him, and then another. I squinted into the darkness and counted at least 4 or 5 figures, all milling around near the tree line. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The man knocked again, harder this time, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "Come on, just a little water," he said, his tone more insistent now. But I wasn't about to open that door. I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for the keys. Taking a deep breath, I darted toward the driver's seat and started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating a group of men standing in front of me. They looked to be in their 30s and 40s, with unkempt beards and scruffy winter clothes. The man who had been at the door turned his head sharply toward the light, and all at once they started yelling. I threw the RV into gear and drove past them, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, heading toward the nearest gas station. Once I finally had cell service, I called the police, but by then the men were long gone. The officers said they'd investigate, but with no solid evidence or clear motives, there wasn't much they could do. I still don't know what those men wanted, or why they surrounded my RV that night. Maybe they were trying to scare me, or maybe it was something more sinister. Whatever it was, I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and got out of there. It's something I think about every time I pull off the road to sleep now. Who were those men? And what would they have done if I'd opened the door? 2 years ago, in the midst of a chilly November, I faced something I still struggle to explain. Our small town was blanketed in early snow, the first real sign of winter settling in. I lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom home, the kind that was just big enough for one person. The house had an unfinished basement I rarely visited, just for laundry or the occasional box of storage. It was one of those places that always felt a bit off, as if it belonged to someone else long before me and never really adjusted to a new occupant. That Friday night, the snowfall had picked up considerably. Driving home from work, the roads were slick, the world outside muted and muffled by the heavy flakes. I was eager to hunker down for the weekend, maybe catch up on some shows and relax. By the time I got home around 7, the wind was howling, making the old house creak more than usual. I made dinner, watched the new episode of my favorite series, and later, half-heartedly browsed YouTube while lying on the couch. The sound of the storm was comforting at first, a natural white noise as I scrolled through my phone. Around 10 p.m., I got up to use the bathroom. As I padded down the hallway, something made me pause. I heard a faint noise from below me. My first thought was that the old house was shifting under the weight of the snow, but then I caught it again. This time, it was more distinct. It wasn't just the random groan of wood or metal. It was movement, faint but deliberate, like the sound of someone pacing. I stood frozen for a moment, heart beginning to thump a little harder. Forcing myself to rationalize, I opened the basement door and flicked on the light. The bulb cast a dim yellow glow down the steps, leading into the cool, open space below. With slow steps, I descended into the basement, each creak of the stairs echoing against the cement walls. The basement was mostly empty. A few boxes here and there, the washing machine, a dusty shelf lined with forgotten jars. Nothing seemed out of place. I waited for the sound to return, but all I could hear was the low moan of the wind pressing against the house and the occasional distant rattle of a loose window pane. Convinced it had just been the house settling in the cold, I went back upstairs, finished in the bathroom, and resumed my spot on the couch. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it again. This time, the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't a creak or a random noise. It was a pattern, a faint yet steady thudding. Footsteps. I sat up straight, the hair on the back of my neck bristling. My mind raced through every possible explanation, none of which made me feel any better. Who could possibly be in my basement? I locked my doors, and I lived alone. It didn't make sense. I got up and stood in front of the basement door, listening intently. Silence. I opened the door and peered down into the dim light once more. Steeling myself, I stepped down cautiously. As I reached the bottom, I felt the chill air wrap around me. The wind was louder here, making it difficult to pick out any other sounds. But then I saw them. Footprints. In the thin layer of dust on the cement floor, there were fresh, distinct shoe prints. They were sharp, like they'd been made moments ago. They started near the center of the room and led directly to the bottom of the stairs where I now stood. I looked around, expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but there was no one. Panic gripped me. I bolted back upstairs, grabbed my phone, and called the police. The dispatcher tried to keep me calm as I told her what I'd seen. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone steady. As I explained, two loud, heavy thuds echoed from below, louder than before. I didn't wait. I ran outside into the freezing night, my breath forming frantic clouds as I waited for the authorities to arrive. When the officers showed up, I explained everything. They entered the house and thoroughly checked the basement, the main floor, the doors, the windows. Nothing. No broken locks, no pried open windows. The prints on the basement floor didn't lead anywhere. They stopped abruptly at the foot of the stairs. The officers couldn't explain it. They assured me they'd keep an eye on the area and to call if anything else happened. I didn't sleep in that house again. I booked a hotel for a couple of nights until I could think about what to do next. The whole thing gnawed at me. If no one had broken in, and there was no way in or out of that basement, then what? Or who made those prints? Were they still there, hiding somewhere I hadn't thought to look? Or was it something else entirely, something that defied simple explanations? To this day, I still don't know. I don't live in that house anymore, and I've never heard of anyone else having a similar experience. But whenever I think back to that November night, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I just hope that whatever it was, whoever it was, stays in that basement, far away from me. The Halloween of 2014 had me in 6th grade, thrilled to have our first parent-free trick-or-treating adventure. Every other year, one of our parents had always tagged along, casting a watchful eye and reminding us to behave. But this year was different. This year, my friends Johnny, Colton, Wes, and I were free to roam as we pleased. We planned to make the most of it, trading the usual nervous glances over our shoulders for a carefree night filled with candy and excitement. After school, the four of us hurried into our costumes and gathered at Colton's house, ready to hit the neighborhood. The first few blocks felt endless, but the houses delivered. Full-sized candy bars, elaborately decorated porches. This was the jackpot we'd been waiting for. By the time we finished the neighborhood, it was around 8 p.m., and we had bags brimming with candy. But we weren't satisfied yet. There was a nearby area with even bigger houses, known for having the best treats. None of us had ever ventured there, but tonight felt like the perfect time. As we crossed into unfamiliar territory, the atmosphere shifted. The towering trees and wide lawns made everything darker, more mysterious. Despite our nerves, we couldn't resist. We worked our way down the street, house by house, until we reached one that stood out. It was set far back from the road, separated from the neighboring homes. The place looked older, weathered, and faintly foreboding. Johnny hesitated. He wanted to skip it, something about the house putting him on edge. But Wes and Colton brushed him off, and I wasn't about to chicken out either. Together, we approached the porch and rang the bell. For nearly half a minute, we waited in silence. No sounds from inside. Just as we turned to leave, a figure emerged from the shadows near the garage. It was a man, older, maybe in his 50s, with a wide, unsettling grin. "If you'll wait just a moment," he called out, his voice smooth but somehow off. "I've got more candy inside." He claimed to have just returned from the store, though we hadn't heard a car pull in, and the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere didn't sit right. We muttered polite refusals, saying we might come back later, and started to walk away. As we moved, his smile faltered, and his gaze lingered on us. The whole interaction left us shaken. We moved on to the next block, trying to shake off the encounter. The air felt colder, the night darker. We should have turned back then, but the lure of more candy drove us forward. The houses here were sparse, with long stretches of forest between them. Without the warm glow of porch lights, it felt like stepping into a different world. The silence between us grew heavier, our voices fading to murmurs. Then, just as we were starting to relax, we heard it, footsteps coming from the trees. I stopped cold. It was him, the same man from before, grinning that same unnerving grin, stepping out from the shadows. "Hey there," he called cheerfully, his tone at odds with the unease that radiated off of him. We froze, unsure whether to run or confront him. But before anyone could decide, he lunged toward Colton. Luckily, Colton darted back just in time. The man's grasping hands swiped at air, and that was all we needed. We bolted, adrenaline coursing through us as we sprinted down the road. We didn't stop running until we reached the main street, where streetlights and passing cars made us feel safer. We caught our breath, hearts pounding, and then started back toward Colton's house. We thought the worst was over, but halfway back, an old gray sedan appeared. It slowed as it passed us, then turned around and drove by again. The second time, we noticed the tinted windows and the way it seemed to hover near us. By the third pass, we knew it was deliberate. The unease from before turned to full-on panic, and we quickened our pace. When we finally reached Colton's house, we scrambled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. We didn't know what to do. No adults had seen what happened, and we didn't want to tell anyone. If we did, they'd never let us trick-or-treat alone again. We sat there in silence, trying to process what had happened. We never saw that man again. We didn't see the car, but the memory stuck with us. The man's grin, the sedan that followed, the sense that we were being hunted. We never found out what he wanted or why he'd followed us. It's something we still talk about every year when Halloween rolls around, wondering how close we came to a true nightmare. I was staying at a small cabin for the weekend, tucked away in a campground about an hour from the city, living in the hustle and bustle of downtown. I loved escaping into the woods for a few days each fall to soak in the crisp air and vibrant foliage. This place wasn't a luxury retreat. It was $10 a night, and the cabin was a simple 200-square-foot structure with just a single room and a bed in the center. No frills, but it was quiet and peaceful. On my first day there, I spent most of my time outdoors, wandering along a few short trails and enjoying the scenery. By the second day, I settled into a folding chair behind the cabin, just watching leaves scatter in the breeze. The sound of the wind through the trees was soothing, and I might have sat there for hours. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the kind of timelessness you only find in the forest. At some point, I noticed a figure in the woods, about 150 yards away. It was hard to make out much detail from that distance, but it looked like a man standing between the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, still as the trunks around him. I stared for a long time, trying to figure out if he was looking at me or simply gazing into the forest. The longer I watched, the more unsettled I felt. My pulse quickened as my mind played tricks, imagining he was locked onto me. I finally gave up trying to figure it out and went back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. When night fell, the wind picked up. It howled around the cabin, slipping through tiny cracks in the old windows, making the walls creak and groan. Normally, I would have found it comforting, just nature's voice, but not that night. Not after seeing the man in the woods. The noise drowned out everything, including the sound of approaching footsteps. My nerves were on edge. I tried to relax by the fireplace, curling up in the armchair with a book. An hour went by before I heard it, a knock at the door. My heart jumped into my throat. Who would be out here, in the middle of the woods, at this hour? I froze, unsure of what to do. Then another knock, louder this time. I held my breath, my heart thudding so hard it seemed to echo in the tiny cabin. I couldn't decide whether to call out or stay silent. Before I made up my mind, the knocking turned into pounding. Each hit against the door grew louder and more forceful, shaking the thin wooden frame. I was sure they would break through. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence was unbearable. I stood there, straining to hear anything over the wind's shrill whistles. It felt like hours, but it was only seconds before I tiptoed to the door, holding my breath as I looked through the peephole. There was nothing, not a single person outside. My pulse slowed, just slightly, as I stepped away from the door. And then I saw them, two eyes, staring straight at me through the old window near the fireplace. They locked onto mine, unblinking, and my body turned to ice. In an instant, the figure disappeared from view. I stumbled backward, my hands scrambling for my phone on the coffee table. The wind screamed louder than ever, masking all other noises. I dialed the police and gave them the address. They told me to stay put until help arrived, but the thought of staying alone in that cabin was suffocating. Still, I didn't dare run outside. What if they were still out there, waiting? I stayed glued to the armchair, clutching my phone, listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything. When the police finally showed up, the person was long gone. They searched the area and found no sign of anyone. The officers reassured me that it might have just been a prank, maybe a local playing tricks. but I knew better. Those eyes weren't playing. I never saw who it was, never heard them speak, but the memory of those staring eyes has stayed with me ever since. I haven't returned to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. To this day, I wonder what their intentions were. Were they just trying to scare me, or did they have something far worse in mind? Sometimes I replay that night in my mind, asking myself what would have happened if I'd opened the door. I'm just glad I didn't find out.